how would you tell people that? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on this.
All right, hello everyone. Welcome to. I was going to give this like an episode number, but no, this is just a one-off thing, right? It's PaleoLogos and Dapper Dino. We're going to be talking about continuous environmental tracking versus natural selection. And despite what it might look like, this is actually not a debate because, as far as I know, Peter and I largely agree on this topic. So we're both going to be talking about what we think of this. And spoiler alert: we're both like continuous environmental tracking is probably a bad idea. It probably doesn't really work very well. But Peter is a young Earth creationist, and I am not. And so I want to let Peter introduce himself. Tell us whatever you want everyone to know about you, and then we'll start talking about the actual topic.
Sure, yeah. Hi there. Great to be with you again and chat with you. It's been a while, so great that we could do this. So I run a small YouTube channel and talk about young Earth creationism and hominins mostly, but I get into some other topics like geology and paleontology. So yeah, you can check me out there at PaleoLogos.
Awesome, and I do believe that a link to your channel, yep, is at the very top of the channel of this video description. So anyone here, if you are interested in seeing more from Peter, go check out that link. Like I said, it's the first thing at the top of the description of this video. It says first thing is like link to Peter's channel, right there. So continuous environmental tracking is an idea that's been really championed by Randy Guliuzza of the Institute for Creation Research. I don't know if he came up with it, but it's sort of his baby, as far as I can tell. And he's really big on getting everyone at ICR on board. And he's been putting out, I wouldn't quite call them hit pieces, but he's been complaining about creationists who aren't on board with this, and he's been calling them selectionists, which I find is a funny thing, because basically it just means anyone who's not an ICR is a selectionist, basically.
Yeah, you can actually see this even in some of like the papers that they've put out on the topic, but also like in their popular level material, like their little handbooks like this that they put out, and in their magazine, they refer to selectionism as a worldview. And they even say that personifies nature with intelligence and volition, which I think is really problematic to personify their personifying selection as if it is a worldview, which I think is a really problematic way to look at selection, because I don't think most people really approach it as a worldview.
I agree. But let's talk about what it is. And so I want to get your take on what your understanding of it is, because one of the things I've noticed is as I'm reading things from ICR about this, it seems like it's very vague. They're clear about what they don't like, but what actually is going on at like an organismal level with continuous environmental tracking, I'm finding that they're very reticent to actually specify. So what is your take on what the actual claim and model is, if we can even call it a model?
Sure. So from reading their papers and kind of listening to Guliuzza, I think that the general idea here is basically to try to come up with an alternate explanation for diversification, which personally I think isn't all bad. Now, I obviously do think that natural selection and mutations coupled together do drive change in populations of organisms over time. But I think that we could both agree probably that young Earth creationism does need organisms to diversify at a greater rate than we typically observe in the present.
Oh,
And I
definitely
think
does, yeah.
I think that is part of the problem here that they're trying to deal with, which is why I think it's somewhat of an admirable thing that they're attempting to deal with it. Now, I obviously don't agree with how exactly they think that they've answered that problem, but I think it's good to say that they're trying to at least deal with it. So I think basically their approach is it's very coupled, I think, with created heterozygosity, which is the idea that we have a lot of information basically built into the genome of an organism directly from creation. And their idea basically is, I think, that adaptation happens less through random mutations and through selection, and more through organisms regulating their genome to adapt to an environment. So kind of less randomness, more of epigenetics and other factors trying to actually just work with what they already have to modify it to the environment. But that's my take.
Well, I have a similar take, which is that from what I read, the only actual mechanisms that seem to be discussed are either phenotypic plasticity, where things like nutrition and how much exercise and what kinds of things an animal or any organism is doing in its life will affect its ultimate phenotype in the end, or epigenetics, where you have things like certain genes can be switched on or off or up or down regulated based on things like um, targeted methylation tagging and stuff like that in the genome and things like that, right? Like, so you can say, okay, well, this particular protein isn't needed, so we'll downregulate it so that some other protein can be upregulated. And how do we accomplish that? Well, in this case, we're going to methylate that section. We're going to make some heterochromatin there, so it's essentially impossible to transcribe this particular gene. Other genes, therefore, are more highly expressed. Okay, now we have a new phenotype coming out of this same genotype. But the problem that I see with that is that we can observe changes in the genome happening as a result of pressures in the environment. So they need a mechanism for the actual genetic sequence of organisms to be changing in response to environmental stimuli, according to their own ideas. But I don't see them ever even attempt to do that. In fact, I went entirely through a fairly long talk from Randy Guliuzza, in which he failed every single time to provide any study that showed any actual changes in the genome. That it was all just phenotypic plasticity and things. And don't get me wrong, I do think that phenotypic plasticity and epigenetics is an important thing to look at. For instance, there was an experiment a few years back that was really interesting where they took bichurs, which are this kind of ray-fin fish that happen to still have rudimentary lungs, and they raised them in a moist but still entirely not underwater environment, right? They had to walk everywhere on their little fins. And they grew more robust fin bones and muscles, and the way that their spines flexed were different from bichurs that had been raised underwater, but they weren't genetically distinct, right? This was just like, hey, bro, if you lift a lot, you'll get swole. Okay, yeah, that works for these fish too. And there's other things like you can raise tomato plants in a environment where they have extra phosphorus and extra CO2 and all the water they could possibly drink. They're going to get bigger. That doesn't change the genome, right? But we need that. And so I think that I agree that continuous environmental tracking basically just relies on epigenetics and phenotypic plasticity for everything. But we know that that's a problem. We can't just rely on those two things. And I think another thing, one of my big criticisms, not so much with continuous environmental tracking, but with its advocates, is that they go around saying that natural selection, or people who accept natural selection, are imputing consciousness and agency onto nature, because the word selection, if you actually select, then you have to make a conscious choice. And it's like, okay, I agree that the word selection at its most basic, right, does involve some kind of agent making a choice. But you have to realize that everyone, from Darwin on, has been talking about this as an analogy. There's no one who's
organisms transcribe their DNA. Are you personifying them as if they are actually transcribing it by writing it down?
And they also translate DNA into RNAs, and then that gets translated into proteins. But no one is sitting there with a grammar book and flipping between
personifying nature.
Right. So one of the things that really bugs me is that it's just a straw man of natural selection on the part of people like Randy Guliuzza and his friends at ICR. Where it's like, oh, can you believe that they're imparting godlike attributes onto nature? And the answer is no, I can't believe that, because they literally aren't. When you read through definitions of natural selection, none of them involve a necessary agency for nature that is of a personal kind, right?
And I think also, I think they even themselves recognize that there isn't really a good mechanism. In fact, even in the 2018 paper in ICC, Guliuzza and Gaskill, they had this sentence, which I found really interesting. The search for the mechanism underlying the adaptive diversification of organisms could be futile.
Okay. Just give up, I guess. Back it up, boys.
That is like the first sentence after the abstract.
Interesting. So,
Yeah.
another thing that I've noticed is that, so I haven't looked at too many of the actual papers, but what I've looked at a lot of is a lot of what they've been putting out on their blogs and in their podcasts. And the primary reason for that is because one of the things that I'm interested in, just as, someone who's interested in this whole topic, is what are they actually teaching people who don't know the details? What is actually filtering down to their audience, their public? Because the thing is, let's be honest, right? The average guy who, listens to the ICR podcast and reads their books that they publish at a lay level does not read their paper. Doesn't want to read their papers. Probably would be confused because they don't have a background in this. And we have a quick super chat. Liege Robert for $5 says, claiming natural selection doesn't happen seems a strange position to take when it's so evidently observational and accepted by young Earth creationists generally. Well, that's actually a thing. They have like a fight with virtually everyone, right? It's like ICR contra mundi. Everyone disagrees with ICR on this, including basically all other young Earth creationists, with some exceptions of like way fringe. And I mean, like, you think Kent Hovind is fringe? Well, no, he's mainstream compared to some of the people who are also anti-natural selection. And we're talking about like, I encountered one guy who didn't think that dog breeds shared common ancestry because that was too much difference. I'm just like, okay, sure, maybe. Like that's the kind of fringe that we're talking about here. So, it seems like we actually really agree on what continuous environmental tracking is saying, what a lot of its problems are. So let's take a look at natural selection. Do you accept natural selection? Why is that? Because I think not everyone knows that young Earth creationists, by and large, accept that natural selection is a force that operates on organisms.
So I think the reason why I accept natural selection is because, it is observable in the environment, right? We have all sorts of examples of organisms which have been selected for, and we can, observe that. And I think part of the problem here is that they aren't very specific about their language, the way in which these people talk about kind of selective forces, and in such a kind of ambiguous way that you sometimes couldn't even distinguish whether something is being selected for or not from their perspective. But there's all sorts of papers. One of the papers which I found interesting, I talked to somebody who was kind of familiar with how this paper was done. It was called Frequency Dependent Bayesian Mimicry.
Okay.
This is kind of an interesting paper because it talks about these snakes, right, that they mimic other venomous snakes, in
like
particular, like the coral snakes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, and
One of
what
the most famous examples.
team did is right, yeah, and what they did is they made rubber examples of these snakes, and basically they put a snake that looked more generic, and then a snake that looked more like a coral snake all throughout the environments where coral snakes are present and then where coral snakes are not present. And what they found was that where the venomous species of snakes were, predators were less likely to attack the models which were painted to look like the coral snake. Right. And where coral snakes did not live, the predators were less likely. A random example, but the point of it is that we see that this isn't something with intelligence. This isn't something with volition. This can work on when we have rubber models of organisms. We can see how the environment is drawn just on patterning alone to select for or against an organism. And that's a perfect example, I think.
Yeah. Now, there's another thing that we're going to call it continuous environmental tracking, or at least I'm going to start calling it CET because I don't want to keep saying all those syllables. So we're going to crunch it down to the initials for now. So heads up, everybody. When I say CET, I mean continuous environmental tracking. One aspect of that I've noticed that I'm confused by what is actually even trying to be said is that proponents will say things like organisms have foresight into future environmental conditions. But then all of their examples involve an organism responding to present environmental conditions. And the closest I could see to something being quote-unquote foresight was a plant that used chemical signals produced by herbivores to change its growth patterns, whether or not it was actually attacked by herbivores. but that's still just a stimulus immediate response. The stimulus is currently in the environment, then comes the response. And in order to say that this is some kind of foresight, I feel like you would have to say that this plant consciously understood that these pheromones from herbivores meant likely future attack, and then chose to respond to likely future attack by basically making itself less palatable. But like, why would you
It's
need to
very
assume
hard to
that?
even tell what they're saying there about the foresight. That to me is one of the most mysterious parts of kind of their whole thing, exactly what they mean by it. It's not elaborated on really in any of the papers on CET that I've read exactly what they really mean about foresight. It seems to be more present in kind of their lectures and kind of lay articles about it. I wonder if part of the idea of foresight is that God creates organisms with the ability to respond, or like with the responses built in, but then it would be God's foresight, not the organism's foresight. So that
Right.
to me is something that I really don't understand where they're going with that.
That idea would at least make sense to me, right? Like, God had the foresight to know that herbivore pheromones might result in increased, or might signal increased attack by herbivores on plants. So plants should have a response mechanism for it. Like, okay, that, I mean, fair enough. If we accept the idea that most organisms are to some extent directly created by a designing God, that's a thing he could do. Okay. But then when they say that, oh, the emphasis is on the organism instead of the environment, and the organism has foresight, and I'm just like, I don't get it. Another example they used was cognitive studies on arthropods, about whether or not arthropods have like an internal map of the surrounding environment they can hold mentally without currently absorbing those aspects of the environment. And they showed several experiments where it turns out that it seems like yes, they can. I think my favorite one was they were having some grasshoppers climb up a ladder, and the ladder had unevenly spaced and sized rungs, and then occasionally rungs would simply be removed at random. And the grasshopper was able to continue to navigate this without needing to constantly glance back at its leg positions, because apparently the inference is it has an internal like 3D map of what the ladder is like, that it doesn't need to constantly observe the ladder to maintain. So when you remove a rung and the grasshopper goes to place a leg there, it's like, oh, no rung there. I guess I'll just move up to the next rung, and it doesn't need to look back to see where that rung is. Which at first I thought was really cool, because that's, when I was a kid, we were told that arthropods didn't have things like a mental experience of the world or anything. They didn't have internal mental maps of things. Turns out, apparently, at least some of them do, which is really cool. So I appreciated. I think Guliuzza. Do you know if it's actually pronounced a different way? You happen to know? Because I don't want to get it wrong.
I don't want to get it wrong either, but I'm there between Guliuzza and Guliuzza. I'm trying to think of that.
Well, I'll tell you what, Dr. Guliuzza,
Mm.
feel free to correct me, because I really don't want to mispronounce your name. I'm not trying to, but I just don't know how to say it. So I'm going to go with Guliuzza for now. So I'm thinking
All
like,
right.
well, thanks, Dr. Guliuzza, for bringing these studies to my attention, because they're really cool. But going from a grasshopper can climb a ladder without constantly looking at its legs to therefore organisms can determine what future environmental conditions are going to be like and modify their own genomes in response is a pretty big leap, right? Like, I feel like you skipped a few steps in the middle there.
Just
I
a
don't know,
few.
just one or two, right? Like, I'm sure you can just cross those T's and dot those I's, and it'll all be okay. But like, I don't understand what the connection is, and it seems like it was a big deal, at least in the talk that I looked at, because this was a lecture that Guliuzza gave. In fact, it's a response to it is going to be coming out on my channel in probably a couple months or so. Peter, I think you've already seen it,
Mm-hmm.
because we were talking about this off air. Which, guys, if you want to see it now, feel free to Patreon or channel memberships. You can see it right now if you want. But yeah, it was very confusing to me. And he also gave some studies about like calorie hoarding in humans as a heritable but not like genetic factor in populations that had undergone severe calorie restriction. Like he was talking about people in China who'd survived one of the various 5-year plans that Mao did, which were all disastrous. I agree with Dr. Guliuzza on that. They were all horrible disasters. But saying that people who had survived that had kids that then had lower metabolisms and were more likely, if very well fed, to develop diabetes, but who were more resistant to calorie restrictive environments. Like, okay, but again, until you can show that there's genotype change, this isn't going to get you every kind of
Hmm.
canid that we have now coming from the arc. Like epigenetics and uh, phenotypic plasticity isn't going to cover the painted dog, the maned wolf, and the jackal all coming from a common ancestor.
Hmm. Yeah, part of the problem here is that they're using an effect which doesn't really change the actual genome of the organism. But the problem here is that what we see is that the organisms of genomes, the genomes of the organisms rather, have changed, right? And so, although their mechanism might be, able, I mean, um, phenotypic plasticity and methylation might be possible to produce some changes, I think we can confidently say that a lot of the changes that we see in nature are not the result of that because we can tie it to an actual genetic change. And
Right. Like
yeah.
we've identified specific mutations, like even in humans, like famously things like
Mhm.
the lactase persistence in humans or lactose tolerance, right? Like we've identified specific changes in the genome that result in the upregulation of lactase that allows it to successfully compete in adult humans, whereas in most humans, after a certain age, it's not sufficiently promoted that it basically just doesn't get made in sufficient quantities to allow for efficient lactose consumption. Which, by the way, here's a quick thing: most young Earth creationist speakers get this wrong and say that some other regulatory sequence was broken that was supposed to turn off lactase. Lactase doesn't get turned off. It's just not sufficiently promoted to basically be successfully produced in large quantities in adult mammals normally.
Mm.
The mutation that actually causes lactase persistence actually strengthens the promoter region, so it promotes more strongly, which actually means that presumably you're actually making less of the other digestive enzymes. But if you're getting regular access to a high density calorie source, that's okay. That's a good trade off. So, um, the NB asks,
Another
"What's a
thing is
genotype?"
that,
I actually want to answer that real quick. So, sorry, it's. I want to make sure the audience is going to track.
yeah, go ahead.
So, a genotype, you can basically just think of it as literally what's the sequence of your DNA and what is the order of that sequence in how many chromosomes is it broken into, right? So, if you wanted to give your genotype, you would list out every single um, base pair in order, each of your chromosomes, and that would be your genotype. So for a genotype to change, that sequence has to change. A base pair needs to be switched, deleted, or added, and that's a change in your genotype. Other things that might affect your genetics, like your epigenetics, that affects things like the shape of the chromosomes, how available various parts of the chromosomes are for gene expression. But as long as that sequence on the actual chromosome stays the same, that's not a change in genotype.
Hmm.
Sorry, go ahead.
And that's one of the major things here, right? Methylation basically means that an organism can have this genetic marker basically that can stop the promotion of this gene, stop it mainly from being made into proteins, right? And that's what methylation is. That's one of their mechanisms. Another would be histone modification, right? When basically you have the DNA clump up in such a specific way that it can't be usually read by the basically the piece of protein machinery that comes along the DNA strand to decode it and make it into the messenger RNA. But those are the methods of epigenetics.
Right. Yeah, because your genome is also affected by its physical state, like in terms of like what other chemicals are around it and what physical shape it's in, and certain
Hmm.
chemical tags like histones and methylation and things like that can cause it to basically be impossible to transcribe certain parts, things like that. Um, so we know of genetic changes to the genotype that have occurred in human history that provide some selective advantages. And another thing is the idea that selection just doesn't occur is also odd to me. Like we, it seems like ICR acknowledges that differences in genotype can lead to differences in phenotype, and that there are differences in genotype, and that differences in phenotype can cause to do better or worse in an environment. How do you then avoid the consequence that results in natural selection? Like that's just it just follows logically. Like
Yeah.
I mean, we can see natural selection occur in things that aren't even organisms, right? Like if you have a chemical solution that has some energy, constant energy input, that solution will select for stable molecules. Given a long enough
Stop
time.
personifying
Oh
solutions.
my goodness, I know. Which ironically, ICR still personifies things that aren't persons all the time because that's just how humans talk, right?
Yep.
I can look at the sky and think, I think it might decide to rain today. That doesn't mean I think that the sky is literally some kind of god who will choose whether or not I get rain. I'm using an analogy, I'm using some colloquial speech, and I don't want to have to say every time I talk about the weather, well, gee, I think the barometric pressure combined with this pressure front coming in from the west, like, no, I don't need to do that every time. Now, Maddie might from Science Side Up, but that's because she's a meteorologist. So,
Some of the papers that have been put out on the topic of continuous environmental tracking, I found really overall irrelevant to the actual discussion. One of those
you
was
don't say. That was
one
mean.
of those was the 2019 paper. It's called "The Continuous Environmental Tracking Hypothesis: Application in Seed Dormancy and Germination in Forest Ecosystems." And it's by Tom Hennigan and Randy Guliuzza. That was one of the ones that I thought was really did not have a lot of importance at all to this whole discussion, because really what they were just talking about is the observation that organisms have sensors and can sense environmental pressures.
Which isn't news.
It's not. And really, like, they tried to basically the point of the paper somewhat seemed to be to argue that this was a prediction of continuous environmental tracking, that we would find these. But I feel like we found, I think it should be common sense that organisms can respond to their environment, because we have eyes. We look at the environment, we see, we respond, right? We have all sorts of systems, even in our own body, that we could understand that we do that. And why wouldn't we think that other organisms can as well? So I don't really feel like that's at all a distinguishing prediction of continuous environmental tracking in the slightest.
Well, the thing is, when you say it's a prediction, you have to be predicting new data that no one else was predicting otherwise, or it's not a new prediction, right? Everyone is predicting that organisms have ways to sense environmental conditions and then react to them, right? All the way from bacteria down, on up, right? So bacteria have various chemical receptors on their membranes that inform them what's going on. They can sense things like gradients towards nutrients. They can sense hormonal gradients from other bacteria, which is how they tend to communicate. They have all sorts of chemical sensors all over that allow them to sense their environment and react. Otherwise, they would just die unless you just kept them in a solution of like pure food, which I guess you could do in a lab. But that's not normally how bacteria are going to be encountering their environment. So, yeah, it's a very weird thing for them to say, oh, look, this organism can respond to the environment. Like, yeah. We all knew
and
that.
Part of the problem here is this specific example really has nothing even to do with changes in phenotype even a whole lot either, if I remember correctly. It's a lot of it is about how like seeds sense like humidity and temperature and things like that, and like know how to germinate. No, there I am personifying nature again, I guess.
How dare you, sir?
But the point there being, that's not even a mechanism of like getting a new phenotype. That's literally just a seed growing.
Yeah,
it's a single organism. So that to me just really meant that this paper really wasn't helpful in the slightest. And that, yeah, I think we could all have agreed before this paper was ever written that there were ways in which organisms sense environments, and that benefits an organism.
Well, with the seed germination, all you have to do is visit the desert. I live in the desert, and at the end of every rainy season, there are all sorts of plants that only germinate once it rains enough. Like, how do they know to do that? Well, we've known for...
They had foresight.
Yeah. They predicted it's going to be rainy this year on the basis of something or other. And so they decided to germinate consciously because we shouldn't personify nature. Um, so I now you're probably more familiar with this than I am. What has been the general response to this idea from the broader young Earth creationist community? Because my understanding is that it hasn't been terribly positive, but then I also did see Robert Carter giving some positivity to it recently. So maybe I'm wrong about that.
So I think generally the one is one of kind of rejection, but I think there are some parts of it which tend to be attractive. I think one of the parts that to me is at least somewhat, I guess, important is the part about basically viewing this as mechanisms that kind of from an engineering perspective, which I guess to me I don't think is all that bad of an idea to view systems in nature as kind of mechanical because in a lot of ways they are very similar in kind of how they work. But and obviously I believe that God created organisms and that there probably is something there about, mechanisms being created by a mind and some similarities there. But I think that is really the extent to which I think that this is kind of a good idea. So obviously, a lot of creationists don't like this a lot, and obviously, it's caused these big, huge disputes. Right? Jason Lyle had a long paper in the Answers Research Journal, I think it was, arguing against Guliuzza's work, and he left ICR because of that, I believe.
My understanding was
Um,
that he didn't officially give a reason, but it's easy
yeah.
to read between the lines because most of what he's been saying about ICR recently has been how bad their take on natural selection is.
Yes, you're right. So and part of this, so I think generally the broader public, I don't think necessarily really accepts ICR's vision on this, and a lot of creation scientists wouldn't either. I think it's a very small group that really does. But I think that part of the why this is such a big deal for me specifically is kind of how at the beginning we were kind of talking about how they're setting this up as selectionists and selectionism and all of that because they are clearly trying to create a narrative kind of around this. The narrative which they are trying to create is that believing in natural selection is somehow unbiblical, that it somehow goes against the faith, goes against young earth creationism and whatever else. And therefore natural selection is almost basically a heresy, which and even like in their latest magazine they had this whole section, I think I showed it to you, where they're kind of comparing like belief in natural selection to like eugenics,
Yeah, that was
which
really, really weird and gross.
it was terrible. I mean, it's really just trying to put the worst possible light on your opponent. Like, if you really don't think natural selection exists, I'm not going to demonize you. I'm not going to, say that you're a eugenicist, but apparently if you do the opposite, they can. But yeah, I think that taking this into the moral realm is really where this is getting dangerous, to try to cause these divisions or portray other people as being unbiblical because they hold to some scientific theory about how organisms get weeded out in a population over time.
Well, I've noticed that as a big part of the discourse around biology in young Earth creationism generally, that there's a lot of attempts to try to make things that I don't think have strong moral implications into things that do. For instance, before we got on air, I was talking to you about Mr. Batman and how apparently his best argument that he has about why evolution is bad is if evolution is true, then why don't you do horrible things to your children? And it's like I don't see how that's an argument, or why evolution being true would then make that a thing that people would do. Now, of course, he's an extreme example, right? But you also get things like get Answers News, which is almost entirely about, at this point, it wasn't always the case, but at this point, if you watch newer episodes, it's almost entirely about social issues and like human interest stories. And then they say, isn't it terrible how the evolutionists have made it so XYZ thing that we think is sinful is now just common? And it's like I don't really see the strong connection here. Um, Now, sometimes it's because I don't agree with them that whatever they're talking about is necessarily a problem. But sometimes I do agree with them. Like sometimes they'll talk about like violence and things like that. I'm like, yeah, that is a problem, but I don't see why it is that I think that this connects strongly to your arguments about whether or not Canidae counts as a kind or whether it should be lumped into like Canoidea. I mean, I don't know.
So part of this, I think you're correct that young Earth creationists obviously do not think that an old Earth interpretation of the Bible is correct or really a good interpretation of the scriptures. And as a result, a lot of the times they tend to kind of very, very poorly portray, theistic evolutionists and progressive creationists. And I'll say they're wrong, but I don't think demonizing them and, is really a very Christian thing to do. And I think that's part of this, that some groups of creationists have gotten so used to this kind of collective mindset of we are the inside and those people are the outside, that they're now trying to kind of create these schisms kind of within young Earth creationism itself, portraying people who are really right. Creationism isn't like a big, huge community. They have a very small community already, but they are trying to narrow it down even further to those who are kind of faithful to the scriptures according to what they mean it to be. Apparently, natural selection is anti-biblical, but
Actually, that's something that if I ever get to Todd Wood, I'd like to talk to him about because he wrote or co-wrote a book called "The Fool and the Heretic." And one of the things that he's talked about, I don't remember whether or not it's actually in the book or if he's talked about it like in connection to talking about having written it, but where he was saying that he would have these conversations with people who were old Earth creationists or theistic evolutionists, whatever, and frequently it would come down to him saying something like, "I'm just trying to take the Bible seriously," and they would respond with, "Okay, that's great, but so am I." And at first he thought, "Well, no, I don't think they are." And eventually he came to realize after interacting with them more and more that, yes, they were. You can have good faith disagreements about the proper way to interpret biblical texts. And that doesn't mean that you don't believe them. It doesn't mean that you exited Christianity. It doesn't mean you think that the Bible is less important. And I think that's one of the things
precisely
that gets lost. And I think that this thing with continuous environmental tracking, where you're trying to say like, oh, only this, what's increasingly a fringe group. Like ICR used to be the mainstream of creationism, but it's become more and more marginalized over time. It's less and less influential. And I think this is their attempt to reassert themselves as the core, but ironically, it's doing so by just making themselves even more on the fringe.
Yeah, I mean, they've certainly made like enemies over this, I'm sure, and
we
it's
know of
not
one by
very
name,
helpful
Jason
towards the
Lyle.
public perception. Yeah, exactly.
So one thing I want to talk about, because I feel like it should probably be illegal to talk about continuous environmental tracking without talking about this, which is the Luria-Delbrück experiment. Are you familiar with this?
I'm not.
So this was an experiment in genetics that was set up and done before we even knew what the structure of DNA was. But we're talking like I think this is about 80 years ago that this experiment was done. But there was still a genetic model based largely on Mendelian genetics, but it was understood that there were mutations that occurred because sometimes brand new genetic traits would pop up and they would then be heritable. So we knew that a new thing had occurred, and that's where we got the idea of mutations, right? Well, one of the things that was known to occur was antibiotic resistance in bacteria. And at this point, there was still a question like, do organisms mutate in response to the environment? Or are mutations something that just happens in the background, and then occasionally those mutations can be helpful? What was done was they took a large a large number of populations of bacteria. They were going to expose all of them the same amount of antibiotic, which would be a significant, but probably not completely lethal to the whole population kind of amount of antibiotic. And so the prediction was, if this large range of populations all respond by mutating, gain resistance, then they should all result in similar levels of antibiotic resistance after a certain amount of time, because they should all have this mechanism to mutate. And if instead it's something that just happens in the background, then some populations will contain pre-adapted members. Other populations will start out with very low levels of resistance, but then fortuitously someone will mutate to get a relatively high resistance, and then you'll get a population bloom after a certain amount of time, and then other populations may entirely fail to ever adapt to the environment and may simply stay at very small populations or go extinct entirely. And so you have this clear prediction. If mutations just happen in the background, then we see a wide range of levels of resistance in these bacterial populations. And if they happen in response, then we should see relatively uniform. And the thing is that the experiment was run and it showed a wide range of responses in the bacteria. Some populations never developed any resistance, some only did later on in the experiment, some started out with a relatively high level, which meant that the genotype of these bacteria was not adapting to the environment by purposeful mutation. And I wonder if that's one of the reasons why that's never even brought up as a mechanism for continuous environmental tracking, even though, for it to make sense, that must be what's required. Organisms must be mutating mechanistically in response to the environment, even though we've known for almost a century at this point that they observably do not.
Yeah, targeted mutations would definitely be necessary to kind of continue with their vein of thought, I think.
I agree. In fact,
Yeah.
to the point that I know of some creationists who are perhaps not quite professional, but who are frequent here on YouTube at least, who have essentially said that they think that there are targeted mutations that occur, and I think they're trying to tie it back, at least thematically, to the same idea as continuous environmental tracking. We'll talk about things like, there are genetic hotspots for mutation, which there are, but that's not the same thing as saying these spots have targeted specific mutations that occur in them in response to the environment, which is what would need to happen. Instead, what an actual mutational hotspot is, it's just more likely for this particular spot in the genome to mutate. But what that mutation is still going to be random, and whether or not it will occur is still going to be a chance-based thing, right? You can say, well, this portion of the genome has, a 2% higher chance of mutation in any given, reproductive event. Well, okay, that still means it's a fundamentally random thing, but there's a distribution of probabilities, and the probability here is a little bit higher than it is elsewhere. That doesn't give us targeted mutations. And do you think that continuous environmental tracking, to be taken seriously, would need to find targeted mutations like that? Because I do.
I think it would, because really, in my mind at least, what we know about the continuous environmental tracking hypothesis so far really does not explain anything except very, very limited examples like that they've brought up, like cavefish. But yeah,
Okay,
I don't.
we have to
Yeah,
talk
we
about the
definitely
cavefish.
need a mechanism. Yes, we do need to talk about the cavefish.
Because I looked into this cavefish thing, right?
Yep.
So this
Did you check out the
cavefish.
same paper as I did?
Yep, I did the exact same thing.
Okay.
Because one of the things is, it's a little bit, to me, it was a little bit unclear when ICR was talking about it, that they were talking about this as an epigenetic phenomenon, right? But when that got filtered down to Genesis Apologetics, which is sort of like a secondary group that sort of distills, often badly, what primary sources in creationism are doing, they were very clear. This is an epigenetic phenomenon, this blindness. And look, when they took these fish and they raised them in light, they gave birth to fish that could see. But then you read the paper that they cite, and it's actually that they're taking different groups of cavefish that they were hypothesizing had developed eyelessness separately, which meant that the reason they were eyeless would be different between each population, which then meant that between them, they had all the genetics required for fully functioning eyes. And so the hypothesis was, well, if we breed them together, the hybrids should have eyes regardless of environment, because at that point, they will have a full set of functioning eye genes, which is what happened. I don't see how you can get from those mutations leading to separate causes for eyelessness that can be reversed when you combine the two genomes to continuous environmental tracking. That sounds like very explicit separate events of natural selection in different populations.
Yeah, that's a good point. Not to mention, we would be able to just observe directly whether or not there was a mutation there.
But
and
one of the things is, shouldn't those fish without crossbreeding be able to produce sighted offspring if they're raised in light, if continuous environmental tracking is the actual answer for why all of this happened? What was your take on the paper?
So my take on it was, I think obviously, yes, this is an example of organisms responding to their environment and changing their phenotype. I mean, yeah, that's obvious. But the problem here, first of all, the underlying structure there. I think part of this is that they don't really have any explanation for how this system came to be. So I guess they're just going to probably assume that God made the system in the beginning. I'm not sure if,
You're saying
you know,
ICR would
that,
assume this.
yeah,
The
I'm
researchers
assuming
did.
that's I don't know exactly what their take is, but I'm assuming that would be it because they don't really provide any other explanation for how exactly the system came to be.
Right.
And, I'm open to that possibility. But the problem here, once again, going back to kind of what we talked about earlier, is okay, we can trace this exactly to, okay, the fish methylates and it adapts over several generations basically to come to this phenotype where it's blind, it has the pale skin, it now can use more of its energy rather than making proteins to color itself just for regulating metabolic functions. But the problem is this really isn't analogous to a lot of the examples that we actually see in how organisms have speciated within a created kind. So, for example, you brought up earlier lactose intolerance. That was a good example. Another example could be like something like polar bears, right? Polar bears are white, and if I'm remembering correctly, it is because they lost the function of this allele, which basically creates the pigment coloration in brown bears, which polar bears are believed to be descended from. And the issue there then is that we once again see this is a mutation, right? So regardless of whether this system works to make cavefish go, which I think it does, we can observe that if continuous environmental tracking were to be applied to these examples, it could not explain them in the slightest. So if we were to look at polar bears, what we would expect to see is that they were down regulating their this gene for making the hair color proteins, but it's not. It's mutated, which is stopping it from working. It's not just down regulated or stopped from functioning. It is broken. And that tells us like a lot of things, right? It tells us not only that these mutations are actually introducing something that can be beneficial to a population, but also how do we get that in a whole population? Well, it's a mutation, and this isn't something that's epigenetic, and therefore the only way we get it in the population is through some type of selection.
I want to point out, Tesla Ranger in the chat says polar bears are black. They just have white fur. It's not even quite that. They have black skin, but their fur is actually technically clear.
It's clear, yeah. There aren't those coloration proteins at all, I don't think.
Yeah, it's just that it's thick. So when you have a lot of clear strands stacked together, it comes across as white. However,
yeah, I don't know if I said the white skin. I was trying to say the white.
You didn't say. I think you just said were
okay.
white. So yes, coloration in polar bears is a little bit more complicated than just them being white. However, when you ask someone what color is a polar bear, and you just show them a picture of a polar bear, the answer is going to be white. So I'm not going to get on people for saying that polar bears are white because, I mean, they are. It is more complicated when you get into it.
I was referring to pigmentation of the fur specifically.
So, and I think there were a few other similar papers. I think one was looking at like forest mouse tail length or something like that. And there were a number of these papers that all just, to me, ended up with the same thing. ICR is trying to present this as continuous environmental tracking, for which their only mechanisms are epigenetics and phenotypic plasticity, except that the paper themselves is saying that no, these are actual mutations, and we can tell because of the pattern of inheritance when we cross populations. Because one of the things you have to remember is, I don't think ICR rejects Mendelian genetics, do they?
Sorry, I couldn't hear what you said.
I don't think ICR rejects Mendelian genetics, do they? I mean, maybe they do.
No, I don't think they do.
Well, okay, but that means then that they should know better with these papers, because these papers were using the basic inheritance patterns of Mendelian genetics to say, okay, is this a genetic or an epigenetic phenomenon? And in every case, the papers they were pointing to came to the conclusion genetic, whereas ICR then says, without any mechanism for genotypic change, we'll say, oh, we'll see this as an example of continuous environmental tracking, whereas no, it's a direct counterexample. It doesn't work. So I'm just curious,
Right.
do they not know?
Yeah, I mean that seems to me to be really problematic. To be obviously, yeah, there's different mechanisms we can get the same phenotype, but the whole point here is that we can distinguish at the genomic level how exactly that phenotype comes about. And if we would mutate, for example, a fish, we could probably get it to develop into something that looks a lot like a blind cavefish.
Oh, definitely.
By like stopping the production of the proteins that give it coloration and the eyes and everything. But the point is, we can distinguish very easily between that. All you have to do is look at the genome and tell whether or not those genes are broken by a mutation or not. And that is really the primary prediction that would come if you say that this has come about through mutations and natural selection. And that's verified 1,000 times over.
Well, actually,
much more than that throughout the natural world.
Let me make a hypothetical continuous environmental tracking prediction of my own. Like, if I think there's something to this is what I would predict to see. We're going to use cavefish as an example. But then when I finish, we're actually going to take a quick break. And then when we come back, I want to hear your response. So you'll have some time to mull over it while you refill a water or whatever you need to do. So my prediction is, if we had two different populations of fish with these environment sensing and predicting mechanisms for changing their own genomes, and they both separately entered caves, I would expect the genetic changes to be the same in both groups, such that when you brought the groups back together, you could not use a Mendelian distribution of traits to then find that about half the time or so, actually probably more than that, you end up with sighted offspring, because both organisms make the same genetic changes to turn off eye creation. But, however, later, if enough time went by, might be able to get them to just reverse those changes and become sighted again, because they have sensory things that can create targeted mutations. So I would presume you could back mutate. Now, that second part would just be kind of like the icing on the cake. If the first part happened, I would say, hey, CET successful prediction, number one. If the second one happened, I would say, hey, even more stronger confirmation that CET is just blowing natural selection out of the water. That would be my prediction. So what I'm going to do is we're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back in a few minutes, and I want to hear what Peter's take on that is, and then we're going to take a look at how that either was or wasn't matched by the paper, which you very conveniently have a printout of, which is really cool, because I actually really like that paper. So, we're going to take a quick intermission, guys. Please stick with us. We will be back in just a few minutes. All right, everybody, we are back. Thank you very much for sticking with me. Those of you who did. Um, yeah. What do you
Yes.
think
So
of my hypothetical prediction? From me being like, oh, I believe continuous environmental tracking is totally the way it goes. Here's my prediction. I want to start with: do you think that that's a good prediction if continuous environmental tracking is correct?
I think it's a good prediction, especially because of the need for targeted mutations. I think to actually produce what we see in the real world. So yeah,
Okay.
beyond just their example of phenotypic plasticity in cavefish.
Now, fortunately for us, you already have the paper, and I think we already talked about it. But does the prediction come true when you actually run the experiment with actual cavefish from the real world?
Unfortunately, I don't think so.
No, that was my interpretation as well. So,
And I think they even kind of picked up on this in the paper itself. Really.
ironically, because they're not investigating continuous environmental tracking, the authors of this paper have probably never even heard of it. Because I can almost guarantee you they're not paying attention to what ICR is saying.
And really, even in the paper, they picked up on this. They said they were quoting Gore et al. 2018, and they said recent sequencing of the Pachon cavefish genome and other studies revealed no inactivating null mutations in essential eye development genes. So that indicates that they already know what would be expected if you had the normal process of evolution through natural selection and mutations. They already have that prediction. They say, this doesn't match that prediction. Well, okay, sure, I'm fine with saying that this is not an example of evolution, but then you kind of have to deal with the fact that almost all of the real world examples that we have of speciation do in fact show inactivating or activating mutations.
Right. Oh, could I ask you a quick favor? If you have the link for that paper handy, if you could just send that to me so I can add it to the description, because I want people to be able to easily access that paper.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I agree with you. This, to me, this paper, which was touted by ICR as an example of continuous environmental tracking, far from it is actually a direct falsification of the only thing that could make CET work as a mechanism for change of organisms. Because the thing is, look, they're trying to say like, oh, nothing about the mainstream evolutionary worldview is correct. Okay, great. But the thing is, we not only see evolution occur at least in the minimum level, right? But also we can see the evidence of natural selection as well as actual natural selection occurring in real time. Like this isn't what Ken Ham likes to call "quote unquote" historical science. Like no, you can watch it happen in a lab. Like, granted, you probably can't watch it happen very easily with like elephants who have like ridiculously high generation times and a 2-year gestational period, which just because of the long lifetime makes it a little bit tough with them. But like, flies exist, bacteria exist.
Although elephants are actually a good example of natural selection and the loss of tusks over time.
True, tuskless trait is spreading throughout. I think especially African elephants, which Asian elephants were always as long as people have really been interacting strongly with them. There's been variation in like tusks. Females were much more likely to not have tusks, but even with males, it wasn't always the case. But with African elephants, until very recently, tusklessness was extremely rare in both sexes. And now it's becoming much, much more common. And what's the selection pressure? Poaching. Humans are killing off the tusked animals, but if the only reason you want to kill an elephant is for the tusks and it doesn't have them, what are you going to do? Risk your life as a poacher? Because that's often a death sentence in some countries. You're going to risk your life to poach a worthless elephant? No, no one's going to do that. That's crazy.
Unless you're a poacher.
Well, even then, like what I'm saying is like,
and then you do.
If your economic incentive is only to get the tusks, don't
just go to Siberia and find a mammoth tusk. There's lots of them in the permafrost, and you don't have to kill an elephant.
Okay, but pro tip: if you're in a place that's telling you that they're selling you mammoth ivory, there's a very good chance that's bone. Mammoth ivory is legal to trade, but if you're just at like some street vendor on like the streets of like, where was I? Goodness, now I don't even remember. It happened to be in Korea at least. I think it happened in Hong Kong too. Trying to sell me mammoth ivory. Like this is just bone.
Oh really?
This is bone.
I have a piece of mammoth ivory in my collection, and I have looked at it. Yeah, it actually came from some site in somewhere in America. I can't remember exactly where it was at the moment, but yeah.
Well, so one of the things people will do is they'll say, "Oh, look, if it were bone," and then they'll put some soot on it with like a lighter or something. The soot wouldn't wipe out. That's not true. That's just a lie. The easiest
Yeah.
way to tell is hardness test. So if
Mm-hmm.
you have something on you that's softer than enamel but harder than bone, you can scratch it. It's bone. It's not
Plus,
mammoth
looking at it in
ivory.
cross section, it has quite a
Yeah,
bit of
that
a
can
different
help.
appearance than bone.
Yep.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's off topic. It's just a pro tip. If you're ever in a
Yes.
place with shady street dealers, do not trust that their quote unquote ivory is really mammoth ivory. It's very likely just random animal bone.
Be
Which,
critical when you purchase rock specimens overall and fossil
of
specimens.
course, if you just like the carving and you want to buy it for that reason, go right ahead. Just don't think that it's actual ivory. It's probably. So, I think at this point, one of the things I want to say is I actually want to discuss more in depth what you think of Robert Carter's take on this, because I think you might be a little bit more friendly to Robert Carter's assessments and give him a little bit more charity than I do, because I have a I wouldn't say it's a grudge, but I have a noticeable bias against Dr. Robert Carter because of a couple things he's done in the past, one of which directly involved me. So I feel like I might not be the fairest individual. But he recently put out a video in which he talked about what he really liked about continuous environmental tracking and how he thought it was really cool to think about animals from a engineering standpoint and as active participants in their own adaptation to the environment and whatnot. Now, I took that as a fairly unreserved endorsement of continuous environmental tracking, but you didn't. So,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
you might
So
be right.
Doctor.
Go ahead.
So I wouldn't say I'm necessarily certain on this, but in this video, Dr. Carter was basically just talking about how creation scientists should get along and stop fighting with each other. Basically, was the point of it. And he was talking about Dr. Guliuzza, and I from what I understood of it, what he seemed to be saying was that it was important to view creatures systems as kind of mechanical, as being a result of kind of design, and looking at them in kind of functional way like that. But I really didn't think he was really buying into continuous environmental tracking. At least that was my take, because at that state, I think he even said that he didn't really think even Dr. Guliuzza would completely dismiss natural selection, and he said he would put a lot more emphasis on natural selection. But I guess you could possibly suggest that he was making a distinction between natural selection and continuous environmental tracking, and say that they could be working in tandem.
Okay. Look,
I
that's fair. And
I
like I
so
said, I'm not someone who is currently very well inclined to be giving Dr. Carter the benefit of the doubt, and I recognize that that's a fault of mine, problem with me. So I wanted to get your take on that, and I think that's a reasonable take. I'll
yeah,
probably rewatch the
I
video with your points in mind, and I will probably come to a different conclusion than my initial one, which was rather uncharitable. In part because he once tried to dox me, but he ended up giving personal details of someone else on creation.com, which I didn't
okay.
appreciate. But I do want to say it did get fixed, and instead the wrong person's information was taken off, and instead I was mentioned without personally identifying information. So that was appreciated. But
Good for you, not for the random person.
well, I don't think the random person is going to catch too much flack, but like it's not a good look, guys, over at creation.com. Um, but oh well, it got taken care of. I think it was brought to the attention
Yeah.
of Jonathan Sarfati, and he made the change. Thank you to Dr. Sarfati.
Okay.
He and I have a lot of things we disagree on, and I feel like we wouldn't necessarily get along in person, but I do appreciate his dedication to not calling out the wrong person. But then the other thing that bothers me about Dr. Robert Carter is when he was doing that, where he was very confident that me and Erica and Dan were very wrong in our criticisms of him. He was willing to call us out by name and say that oh, the tone that you guys used was inappropriate and whatnot. But then later, when he admitted that one of my points against him that I made in the very series that he was complaining about was in fact valid, he just called me some critics, I was like, oh, so now you don't say who I am. Now I'm just some critics. I get it. I see how that is. And is it petty? Yes. Does that change it? No. It's sometimes I can be petty. It's what it is. But that's mostly irrelevant to this. So, um, I want to talk about continuous environmental tracking in terms of what you were talking about earlier with created heterozygosity. It seems to me like if continuous environmental tracking is actually true, would kind of remove the need for any kind of created heterozygosity model. What do you need with preloaded genetic diversity if you can just adapt your genetic diversity on the fly as needed?
Well, I guess in part of this, because I think they would want to argue that these systems, like, for example, the ability of fish to adapt to a cave by managing their. I guess I think they would say a combination, but I think they would say that this. I guess my general understanding would be it would be a combination, simply because they would have to also recognize that some of these things, like polar bears that we were talking about, are actually mutational changes. So I guess they would. My understanding is that they would take a mixed bag. So they would say that a lot of this could be explained through the continuous environmental tracking. Then that which they can't explain, they would try to propose genetic or created heterozygosity rather as the explanation for the anomalous data.
Okay. Well, to me, I think one of the reason I say that, and I think you might be right that if pressed, they would say there probably is both things going on. To me, one of the big problems with created heterozygosity is that you can't fit the genetic diversity evident in what AIG, who is the only people who bothered ever to say what a kind is. Right? They're the only ones who ever bothered to give a list, as far as I can tell. So I just take their list as the list until someone else proposes a better one, and argues for it. So that's why I default to their kinds list, which they only publish as a display in the ARC encounter, by the way, which is very professional, guys.
Have you seen the kinds list on, let's see, isn't there one on the Creation Biology Society website?
If there is, I wasn't aware of it. I would be very interested.
I think there's a citation to a lot of the different baromenological studies, and I think it breaks it down to what they think are the kinds. But
that would be very interesting to see, and it would be news to me. So if you have that, let me know. That would be great.
Okay.
Or if you just know like where to search for it, because I haven't seen it. So I usually just default to the AIG kind, which is basically just a list of biological families for the most part. There are a few exceptions, but for the most part, like every single kind ends in IDAE, which is the taxonomic family ending. It's Canidae, Ursidae, Procyonidae. Like, okay, I get it. It's just families. But it is definitely the case that you cannot pack enough genetic diversity to explain current diversity within current animal families from two individuals on an arc 400 years ago without some kind of extraordinary something else happening. And I think that if CET were true, it could provide an out, which is to say, because it is allowing for targeted mutations, those mutations which are important for these different species can arise in a single generation as a result of continuous environmental tracking. So to me, like if it were true, this would be a great boon to young Earth creationism. And the problem then is you gotta then find an example where you can confirm a targeted mutation in organisms.
And part of the problem here with continuous environmental tracking, created heterozygosity is what I was thinking of. Sorry, is it's something that it's basically almost impossible to actually like provide good evidence in any way that it happened, because you're like, well, all of these changes just came back. I mean, it's very hard to actually come up with any predictions or anything based on created heterozygosity. It's like, well, it just all goes back to the beginning and those organisms had it, and we can't test their genomes in any way, so how do we know that they didn't have it? It's like maybe to a limited extent, but as you said, yeah, you can't even get it to explain a lot, and because organisms within the same kind are so diverse that it can't all be explained by created heterozygosity. So that's why I think created heterozygosity is probably way overused as an explanation.
I do now realize that perhaps we should have defined created heterozygosity, which is a fairly simple idea. It's just the idea that God front-loaded genetic diversity within the genomes of the first organisms that he created. And so heterozygosity just refers to having different versions of the same gene on different chromosomes in your body. So, your body has a pair of each different kind of chromosome in you. And which versions of which genes are in each chromosome can vary. And when they do vary, they're called heterozygous there. So the idea is that there was maximum heterozygosity in the first organisms that God created.
And the problem is that to even explain then, as you were saying, the amount of diversity that we see in modern organisms, that doesn't all fit into, the original members of a created kind, probably. And then they would have to even go further. Well, to probably on the arc, we could narrow it down, but they would have to say almost to the point that, all of their reproductive cells have different combinations than the organisms do themselves to get all of
I've
the
also
diversity we
heard
see.
that. I've actually heard that specifically for humans, where
Mhm.
I've heard some people say. Now I don't know if I've read it in very many professional outlets, but I've heard people hypothesize that the gonads of Adam and Eve were not genetically related to them, basically. That genetically speaking, Adam and Eve's children were no more related to them than random strangers off the street would be. Which
That just seems so strange to me, and it also is kind of weird that people apply that to, Noah's sons as well. Like, if you've ever seen, pictures of, Noah's sons, as depicted, they're often, shown as, Ham being, black, having dark skin. It's like, that's one generation. It's yeah. But that's probably coupled kind of to that influence that, Noah has the ability to transform into all of these within a single generation like that. But that's just rather absurd.
So, do you
I
think
think.
at some point we might see ICR try to use continuous environmental tracking to explain the high level of genetic diversity in what they would consider to be the kinds? Because, the mainstream view is that these organisms have millions of years to explain their genetic diversity, and that they all are going back to a common ancestor. But creationism has to fit all this genetic diversity into a post-flood diversification.
I think it's very likely that that has been the whole motive all along.
Okay.
Although we haven't really heard about it all a lot, I think that is probably the kind of whole driving point here. The point that using this mechanism that we've come up with, we can get this amount of diversification in this time frame. I think that is probably kind of the driving idea behind it. Although obviously I don't think that works, but
I don't either, which I'm sure everyone's unsurprised to hear. Okay. So there's one other thing I really want to talk about for this, and then I think if we want to, we can just say, hey, if you have any quick questions for us, then maybe we'll wrap up. One of the things I want to talk about is ICR is very clear on they want to have a focus on how organisms actively participate in adaptation. And one of the things that confuses me there is I don't think that is something that is ignored, broadly speaking, in science, even in non-young Earth creationist groups, because we have ideas, things like, have you ever heard of niche construction? So niche construction, for those of us, and maybe in the audience who aren't familiar, is the idea that sometimes organisms will move into an environment and they will create their own niche that didn't previously exist. It's not so much that they fill a vacant niche, it's that they create a whole new one. And actually, not too long ago, there was actually a paper published about humans doing this in the form, conveniently, of lactase persistence, where there was no hurting other animals niche available to humans or anything else until humans mutated, have the ability to consume lactose or dairy products late in life. And then suddenly an entire new way of life that had never existed in any organism occurred, where you have people herding other animals get their milk products to turn into, beverages and foods in the form of cheeses and milk drinks and fermented milk and whatever else. And other organisms can do this too, right? So you might get a new kind of algae that ends up photosynthesizing in a place that nothing had ever photosynthesized before, right? There's a new colony there, or maybe like a lichen that does this, or you might get some animal who comes in and, now brand new for the first time, there are epiphytes in this forest that just didn't have them before. They're constructing a new niche, and then other organisms respond to this new presence by adapting to it and various things. And then also just the fact that phenotypic plasticity and epigenetics are a major part of evolutionary biology, like something that evolutionary biologists look at, and things like how much of the transition that scientists see from, say, relatively basal sarcopterygian fish to tetrapods can be explained by phenotypic plasticity. Like maybe a lot of what we see is just fish that otherwise would have been much more aquatic, living in environments where they had to cross the land sometimes, and they just grew more robust, limb girdles. Um, what do you think? Do you think that ICR is underestimating how much organism focus occurs in science generally, or do you think that they do have a valid criticism that more focus needs to be placed on how organisms themselves drive their own adaptation and can even change their environment?
I don't really see the issue that they do there. So I'd kind of agree with you that I think enough emphasis is placed on the organismal level and how exactly organisms are responding to their environment. So I don't think that's actually a problem.
I mean, yeah, I don't either. It's and they're not the only group that does this. There's another group of people who aren't creationists, but like evolution needs a brand new synthesis to bring into the account things like how organisms outside of mutation adapt to environments and how you know non-selectional things can drive evolution. And I look around, I'm like, that's just already evolutionary biology. I don't see what new thing you need us to add. And it feels to me like ICR is kind of doing the same thing, where they're like, oh, no one's paying enough attention to epigenetics. And then I look at like the tens of thousands of papers all about epigenetics, and I'm like, I don't know. It sure does look like people are paying attention. What more do you want?
There's all sorts of papers on the topic, and really, I don't find their papers on the topic to really be that unique. I mean, they're really just repeating a lot of what has really been said already about how epigenetics works, and saying, well, this is proof of continuous environmental tracking. Let's just rename a process that we already know happens
Yeah, that
to
does seem
kind
like
of
the best
prove
case
our point.
scenario. Is CET is just a renaming of phenotypic plasticity and epigenetics, at which point it's just like, well, then what are you bringing to the table?
Yeah. And I think overall, I think as a young earth creationist, I obviously do need organisms to diversify at a more rapid rate than is conventionally believed to be, right? And so I think there are some hypotheses about how exactly organisms could do so, but I think this is an area where we don't have a lot of very good solid answers or mechanisms yet to explain this. And I think that's something that's, I think, important for people like me to say, to admit that that's something where we need more research to go on to say whether or not this is actually, a possibility.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's great that Guliuzza and others are trying to research in this area, because it is, I think, a very obvious issue which does need to be resolved. But I don't think his answer really does solve the problem here. I
Because
have
it's
one
already
quote I
been
wanted to
falsified.
read you.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. This is kind of interesting. It's from the 2018 paper in ICC. They said they were talking about adult response to environmental dynamics. They say Patterson 2007 discusses how the thickness, length, and color of a male lion's mane, which may vary over the course of a single year, depends on its ability to detect at least two conditions: temperature and rainfall. West and Packer also note how the presence of these conditions, available nutrition, and a non-environmental exposure, age, play a more prominent role than genetics in determining the characteristics of the mane. Which I think is kind of interesting there, because that is talking, it doesn't have to do with inheritance, but it's talking about how the environment affects an organism, and then how this organism basically is probably selected for or against based on how full its mane is, because I think that there's an aspect of sexual selection to the mane as well, which I kind of found it was interesting in the paper that they brought that up, because it does seem that this is actually, they just brought up an example of something that's selected.
Yeah, that is interesting. All right, so what I'm going to do now is we're just going to get a little bit of like, hey, audience, if you want to ask some quick questions, go ahead. Probably not going to do it for too long because like this isn't an interview per se, but I figured you guys have been patiently listening to us talk. Time to more intentionally bring in some audience stuff. So the first thing that I'm finding from Unintrigued Feline, who asks, I am always very curious. What I would like to know. I can't read apparently. Apparently, in the last hour or so, I just completely lost the ability to read. Sorry about that, guys. But I would like to know what would convince Peter to accept what we have figured out and reject young Earth creationism. And I think that that's an indication because I think an intrigued feline, like myself, is a former young Earth.
Okay. So that's a good question. I think that because at its basis, my belief in young Earth creationism is based on the Bible, I think what I would need to be convinced of is that the Bible does not need young Earth creationism to basically retain its main message, because I find that young Earth creationism and having a historical Adam and Eve and the description of sin appearing through death is all part of what I think is very important about the gospel and setting up the reason why the gospel is necessary. And so I think there would be a biblical factor of actually being able to be satisfied with explanations by theistic evolutionists or progressive creationists or whatever group you would see there. Scientifically, I think I think there is evidence for young Earth creationism, but I think it would be really that biblical aspect that would really be the deciding factor.
Now, this isn't from the audience, but it is out of curiosity. What would then convince you, and I'm not asking you to do this, but what would convince you perhaps that rather than basing beliefs on the Bible, ought not to base beliefs on the Bible?
Well, I think what would need to be demonstrated would be to demonstrate that I shouldn't trust God's word, and I think that would basically need to be demonstrated.
Well, what kinds of things would demonstrate either that God's word isn't something you ought to trust, or perhaps that the Bible isn't God's word? Because both of those, I think, would result in you not particularly needing to base belief.
Sure. I mean, if one were to argue, for example, that there are contradictions in the Bible, I think that goes against the idea that the Bible is inerrant, which is what I hold to, which I don't think there are contradictions in the Bible. If there were evidence to actually say that the Bible was not divinely inspired, that would go against it. But I think there's good evidence to support both of those things.
Okay. All right. Yeah, because I think if the reason I ask that is that I can see that if you're taking the Bible as true as your first statement, and then because of that, then it follows that young Earth creationism is true, so you would need to be convinced differently about the Bible and what it says. That's one avenue. But also, I suppose that if you then also just stopped believing the Bible was the word of God, then that would also probably be something that at least would open up non-young Earth creationist. Another thing
Yeah, I had a question on my stream the other night. Somebody asked whether or not I would be a young Earth creationist, if I didn't have the Bible. And I said, part of that, probabilistically, I wouldn't, because I probably would not have even thought about young Earth creationism as an option if I hadn't, first been a Christian, right? So I think probabilistically, it's likely that I wouldn't be if I weren't a Christian. But I think that if I had kind of studied young Earth creationism, I think I would see that there is some merit even as a non-Christian.
Okay. Elijah Robert says, PaleoLogos, what do you think would be the best direction for young Earth creationist research? That is, what research questions do you think is are the best areas to explore to add evidence?
Well, if we're going to talk specifically about this question that we were talking about today, about adaptation and how creatures adapt to their environment, I think there's some interesting options. One of those is kind of understanding the correlation between the geologic column, and basically stratigraphy and stratomorphic series, and the predictions of phylogenies. And there's actually some interesting work being done. Some preliminary research was published at the Origins conference this summer. So you can look at the Origins conference abstracts, and you'll be able to find it there. There's a more full paper coming out in the future on this, I think, but that is definitely an interesting area of research. And basically what they're looking at is whether the basically the order of the fossil record matches what would be predicted from a phylogenetic perspective. So that's an interesting way to go, right? To see whether there's what we would expect from kind of typical methods of evolutionary diversification there or not. Another interesting area, which I think definitely we should continue to research, is age hypothesis, which is basically the idea of these genetic elements that can basically move around in the genome. Some of those are ERVs, I think. But those are kind of two areas kind of related to diversification that I think are kind of some important areas of young Earth creationist research that might help us kind of come up with a better explanation in the future for how exactly organisms have diversified.
Okay. Now, this isn't a question, but Unintrigued Feline says that they sent you a visualization of known contradictions within the Bible, and there is a chat. Now, there has just been a super chat. That was going to be the next thing I ask, but I do want to give my quick take on where I would direct research if I were a young Earth creationist. It is very specific. Young Earth creationists, often the same young Earth creationist within the same work, advocate for completely incompatible things, and it's two very specific things. One is that created heterozygosity provide a large amount of the genetic diversity of modern animals, well, and plants, but I mean, let's be honest, people talk about animals most. Animals are cool. Sorry, botanists. So, and then the other one is the waiting time problem. The reason I say that these are contradictory is that models for created heterozygosity resulting in large amounts of genetic diversity require very high rates of intragenic crossover reproductive events. That's where chromosomes swap parts. And these need to happen a lot, and it needs to happen within genes. That's why I say intragenic. The waiting time problem assumes no crossover, especially not an intragenic crossover, because it requires that linkage blocks remain as static as possible, because otherwise you do not get the ballooning time period where you're waiting for subsequent mutations after you get initial ones. I would be researching which of those two things is wrong, because one of them has to be. They can't both be true in the same universe. Either there's a waiting time problem, and created heterozygosity isn't going to cut it, or created heterozygosity is an explanation for most genetic diversity, and there is no waiting time problem.
Or maybe both are wrong.
Well, yes, that's why I said at least one has to be wrong. They could both be wrong. I personally think they're both wrong, right? But young Earth creationists need to get on the ball on that one and at least get an internally coherent model of how genetic diversity arises and changes over time. Because right now, the same person, this is the case for multiple creationists that I've talked to about or heard talk, will say both of those things almost in the same breath. Like you can't have both of them.
Yeah, I'm kind of open to the possibility of created heterozygosity, at least to a certain extent, but I think it's very unlikely to actually have played any major role whatsoever. So I'm kind of on the fence there, where I don't really think there's very good evidence, but I'm not going to say it's necessarily wrong, but that's kind of where I am on that.
Yeah. Now, this is a super chat that came in from Ray Cosby, who says, when you say you don't see Bible, I think that Bible, yeah, when you say you don't see the Bible being contradictory, do you mean internally or with reality?
So I would say I don't believe that the Bible is internally contradictory, because I think a lot of that relies on kind of misinterpretation of Bible passages. But also, I don't think that it is really contradictory with reality. I mean, obviously, there's people who have different interpretations of me who will say that, right? I mean, theistic evolutionists and old Earth creationists would argue that it's not contradictory, even with very long periods of time. And I would say that it is with that. And I don't think we have a full answer to every scientific problem which might be raised against young Earth creationism. But I think that no model has all of the answers yet, and I wouldn't say we have all the answers yet, but I think there are indications that things like radiometric dating, for example, are there are at least some indications that we might need to be more critical than we have traditionally been with them. And so I would say, in that sense, even these places where we don't necessarily have a full answer yet, we might have some indication that there are some problems with the science.
I do know some geologists who might be willing to come and talk to you about what the various problems that you see with radiometric dating are. We could set that up. That's well within the realm of possibility.
Yeah, that might be an interesting talk.
Well, we'll talk. We can talk later, But if that's something you're interested in, let me know, because I'm pretty sure I could get more than one if you wanted. Geologists who do radiometric dating, or who are at least involved in areas where it's important, come and talk to you. So, let's see. An intrigued feline says, "So if all this, if it is all about misrepresentation, then who defines what is the right interpretation? It then boils down to human fallibility." And I believe that this is about specifically the Bible and what the quote-unquote right interpretation of the Bible is.
Yeah. So that kind of argument relies upon the idea that Scripture isn't clear, but the Reformation's guiding principle was that kind of Scripture interprets Scripture. The idea that when you compare Bible verses from different parts of the Bible, they kind of explain each other and work together as a cohesive model to explain them. So the idea there is that, right, from the Reformation, what the reformers were thinking about is that they didn't need priests, right, to tell the people what the Bible meant. And I think part of that is applicable to this as well, that Scripture, I would argue, on the key details relating to salvation and our sin is clear. And I think that those details support young earth creationism. And so I think that more has to do with whether or not Scripture is clear. And I would say, along with the reformers, that Scripture is clear and the key details.
I'm going to be, this is the most theologically explicit I think I'll ever have been on this channel when I say that I think that the explosive multiplication in often incompatible theological speculation within Protestantism after the Reformation is prima facie evidence that perspicuity of the Scriptures is incorrect. But hey, that's just me. I think that is a proof, not proof, but strong disconfirmation of the idea that the Bible is just clear to all who come to it, and they will find the correct answer to how to interpret the Bible. And I look at the people who believe that, and they all disagree on almost everything. Yeah, I don't know. Not that this is going to be a theology discussion thing, because look, as far as Dapper Dino stands, I don't really have theological positions, period. This is not a channel where I give my theological positions, whether they be theist, anti-theist, atheist, agnostic, Christian, Buddhist, whatever. I'll just put that out there. Let's see. And then Intrigued Feline follows up with, if it were inconsistently interpreted and couldn't be, you couldn't reliably determine which interpretation was correct, wouldn't it then mean that it couldn't be relied upon? The Bible, I would assume.
Yeah, I mean, if every single detail were to be contested, I mean, right? I mean, it depends kind of what core things people would agree about, but overall, I kind of disagree with the premise, obviously, as I already said.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, if you think that the Bible is reasonably clear and you're someone who believes in the perspicuity, the Bible is right. Let's see. I don't think I'm seeing more questions. So if more questions come in, we can go into that. But real quick, I'll say, Peter, what have you got coming up?
I have basically nothing coming up on my channel as of now. I have some ideas in the works. I'm hopefully going to be talking about Traced from Dr. Jeanson soon.
Ooh, and that'll be interesting.
And yeah, I've got some other ideas in the works. We'll see what actually gets out there. I've been pretty busy with school, but yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask for a little spoiler, and you don't have to give it, but I'm going to ask for it. What do you think about Jensen's statement that all of the paleogenomic data from Neanderthal finds is unreliable? I think it's nonsense.
Citation needed.
We have an animation for that, specifically for citation needed. I love it. I always love an excuse to pull out the citation needed. Yeah, no, I think it's worse than just we need a citation for that. For me personally, I look at now. Granted, I'm not a geneticist, right? So this is me looking at it as a layperson and then asking people I know who are geneticists and biologists. One of the things I see is if it were heavily degraded, then there should not be a typical Neanderthal genome. Like we shouldn't be able to make a consensus genome with any degree of confidence, but we can, and I think that that is right there. This confirmation of the idea that the differences between Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis genomes are just the result of degrading genetic information. I
And
don't
really,
see
we don't even need the genome to answer this. We can look at the phenotype to answer this as well. Looking at Neanderthals morphologically, guess what? They don't fall in the Homo sapiens clade. And in fact, the genetic evidence lines up with the morphological evidence. Ta-da! We have, right? How unlikely is that we get a degraded genome that somehow ends up perfectly matching basically the phylogeny that we would form from morphology? That's pretty unlikely that that would happen just from a degraded genome. And so that, to me, that continuity between whether you look at the morphology or if you look at the genetics, that Neanderthals appear as an outgroup strongly indicates that, yeah, Neanderthals aren't the descendants of Homo sapiens. They share a common ancestor.
All right. We do have another super chat from Ray Cosby for $10 who says, given the Bible has explicit detail how to make a tabernacle, but no description of galaxies, nebulae, planets, clusters, or biology, should it be the default explanation when we have unknowns?
I think it should only be the default explanation if the Bible explicitly says that God created something, right? Sometimes creationists are just assumed of saying God did it. And sometimes that's what we do say because that's what the Bible says, that God called creatures into existence. But we do need to avoid bringing God in as an explanation for some random scientific fact where the Bible never ever refers to it, right? And so I'm perfectly fine with saying that God, created organisms in the beginning because the Bible directly says that. But when we have these instances where the Bible doesn't respond directly to it, I think it is almost undoubtedly incorrect to try to fit God in as an explanation there where the Bible does not already do so.
Okay. So right now, of course, if you guys do ask more questions, we can talk about those. But I'm going to go over some stuff that's happening on my channel as we start, continuing the wrapping up. So let's see. On the 20th, right now, it's actually looking like we're back to Matt with Maddie because Maddie is on her fully recovered, but she has recovered sufficiently from her recent childbirth that she wants to come on. So as long as I get confirmation from her, she's already said she wants to do it times and whatnot. So I'm waiting on some confirmation. Assuming we get it, we were planning for Matt with Maddie on Tuesday. So Science Side Up is back on the internet. Hopefully, she'll also be up for doing, continuing on our RPGs we do with her and whatnot. So welcome back, Maddie. Congratulations again to Maddie. Gave birth to a healthy little girl. Let's see. Then, if for some reason she can't make it, it'll be Kent with Ben's 93, I think, like that.
Wow.
I'll probably end up making both thumbnails just in case. Let's see. On the 22nd, it'll be the second part of my Does Your Consciousness Vibrate series about spirit science and whether or not your consciousness has a vibration level, whatever that means, which is most of what the series is about, is me pointing out that, hey, these things you're saying aren't real thoughts. Like, that's not a real sentence. It's grammatically constructed like one. Yeah, it's just vague energy. And then on the 24th, I'm going to be discussing a brand new paper that published in the Answers Research Journal by Gabriella Haynes, who is AIG's new paleontologist that they have on board. And it's bad. It's really bad. Yeah, Peter agrees with me on this one. We've both read it. It's It's not a good paper. Well, I'm not sure who's going to be joining me for that. I'm going to be giving priority to people I know who are like top priority is going to be like people who have paleontology background stuff. Then it's going to be other biology stuff. And Peter, you're welcome to come on for that if you want to. Don't feel obligated, but if you can confirm later some other time that that is something you'd like to do, I'll make sure to have you on the panel for that because I know you've read it and I know that you and I both have some critiques, shall we say? Both have things that we're not.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I'll think about that.
So yeah, basically, I'm planning on reading through almost all of it. There might be some introductory stuff that I skip because she spends a lot of time just talking about like, hey, these specimens exist of Archaeopteryx, and it's like, okay, yeah, I'm glad that you did the footwork to tell me what specimens exist, but it doesn't really matter for the point of your paper. I might skip over some of that. But yeah, so if you want to see I think this might be my second paper read through on the channel. The first one was with Dr. Dan, where we investigated a paper purporting to confirm that just like Muhammad said, one wing of a fly carries diseases, and the other wing carries cures for those. And that was a phenomenally bad paper too. For different reasons, actually. So I think with that, we're going to start wrapping up. Are there any last thoughts that you want to give the audience before we actually get out of here?
Yeah, I think generally what you should just take away from this is that, yes, there are different ways that in which we can get a phenotype, how an organism looks, to change, right? And it can look the same from different ways which we can get it to change, right? We can get an organism to regulate its DNA. We could get mutations happen, and it could look very similar as a result. But we can distinguish between those two effects on a genetic level. And really, it's genetics that makes or breaks continuous environmental tracking. And what we know about genetics clearly indicates that speciation and diversification have happened through mutations and not through just genetic regulation.
And I mean, I largely agree. Yeah, I think that until they get a mechanism for genetic change, not just epigenetic change or basically just the effects of good workout, it's not going to matter to any kind of critique of evolution. So with that, guys, I thank you very much for everyone for being here. I hope I see you all on Tuesday, and every subsequent stream. You should always be here for the most important thing, other than taking care of yourself and your family, that you could possibly do is show up for a Dapper Dinosaur stream. Maybe voting. That might take precedence. Depends on where you live, right? If you live in a state where exactly how the vote's going to go, like Massachusetts, where literally every member of the legislature is a Democrat and all elected officials except for the governor always are, who cares? You know who's going to win. But if you live anywhere where it matters, then yeah, okay, fine, go vote. Sorry, I'm being the worst advocacy for civic engagement. Anyway, yeah, I hope to see you guys later, and thank you for coming. We will see you guys next time.
Thanks for watching, but before you go, I just want to say a special thank you to my channel members and my patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above. Bob Knob, Work in Progress, Benthoven, Denny5252, Ian Chen, Landon Knoll, Mabity Babity, McSpooks, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Veed, and Patrick Dennis. As you probably know, YouTube is a very volatile platform, and from month to month my income on the channel can swing wildly. The people you see on screen are directly supporting so that I don't have to worry too much about that, and the channel can keep going as it is, and perhaps even improving. If you'd like to join this team, there are links below to join the channel or in the description to join the Patreon. The Patreon starts as low as $1 a month, and the channel memberships start as low as $1.99 a month. On Patreon, you can even get a discount for pledging annually. If you do decide to pledge, you'll get access to an exclusive Discord server just for channel supporters, as well as early access to all of my pre-recorded videos, often up to 2 months in advance. Higher tiers will unlock even better perks. Now, if the annual or monthly pledge isn't right for you, but you still want to support the channel, there is a merch store down in the description, as well as an Amazon wishlist, just for me. And if financial support isn't something you can or want to do, then if you still want to help out the channel, please just like and share these videos and make sure you comment on them. It really helps the channel out. Thanks again for watching.